Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
I'm going to play you a few clips. You tell me if you hear a theme.
I believe we have got a number of investments which we've identified must be made. We acknowledge that even beyond these announcements and what has already been fully funded in our defense policy update, there's more to do. We know we need to make greater investment in over-the-horizon radar so that we will have stronger situational awareness. The threat environment is becoming more complex, and we have to meet the moment and answer that challenge.
That is our Minister of National Defense, Bill Blair, following a meeting with his U.S. counterpart last month. Bill is vowing to, yes, you guessed it, spend more on Canada's military, even after a round of recent announcements. And that's probably a good thing, because all indications are that our NATO allies are looking at Canada's defense spending, looking at the world around us right now, and wondering what exactly we're doing up here. Canada ranks among the last bunch of NATO countries in defense spending per capita, according to numbers released last week. And when the group meets next month, there's expected to be a lot of pressure on Canada to commit even beyond what they've been promising recently to spend. So why do we always lag behind on defense spending? Are these new investments really making a difference in our military's readiness? Or are they for appearance's sake, to keep those allies happy? What is the current state of Canada's military, and where does it need to be, given, everything happening around the world? I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Matt Gurney is a longtime journalist and a columnist and a co-founder of readtheline.ca, where, among a lot of other things, he loves to write about Canada's military, right, Matt?
Oh, gosh. I get up every morning just thinking, what can I write about the military today? Because it brightens my day, and I know it brightens the day of everyone who happens to read it.
Well, on that note, NATO just published new estimates of how much member countries spend on their national defense, and how we do, and where do we rank on that?
I'm going to answer that question, but let's just set out the important context first, right? Because it's not just where we rank, it's how we compare to the goal.
Right.
NATO countries have collectively agreed to spend 2% of their national GDP, obviously per capita, on national defense. And so what that actually means for every country is different, because the larger your national GDP, the more you are obligated to spend. It's a target of 2%. The United States, for instance, spends just under 3%. So they're spending well above the target. And some of the smaller countries, particularly some of the Baltic countries, actually spend well over the NATO target. But that's because they're so small, and there are baseline costs of the military, and their economies are very small. So they have small militaries, but it ends up being a fairly costly part of national defense overall.
Right.
Canada is one of the wealthier NATO countries. So in theory, we should have one of the larger militaries if we were just spending in line with the NATO target. That NATO target is 2%, and the latest numbers from NATO just came out, as you said, a couple of days ago. By NATO's calculations, we are at 1.37%. So in dollar terms, that's still a significant amount of money, because Canada does have a large economy. But I mean, look, any listener out there, Jordan, right now, they could do the quick mental math. 1.37 is less than 2.
Is that expected? I know Canada has traditionally struggled to fund its military, but I guess I'm asking, how does this compare to recent times? Are we on the upswing or the downswing?
Oh gosh, that's a loaded question. We're gonna make everybody angry with this one, because it depends on how you want to look at it. So the first thing you asked is it expected? Yeah, and it's expected for two reasons. First of all, Canadian budgeting has telegraphed for this year and upcoming years what we expect defense spending to be. So there were no surprises in these numbers. The final numbers are always under adjustment, right? Because currencies go up and down, or national GDP figures are revised, things like that. But the general trend was obvious that we were going to come in at around where we came in.
Okay.
But you also asked the question of, where are we going on this? And the answer is, if you ask the government, that we are going up. There have been a series of defense procurement announcements over the last few months, and those I take credibly. So we have agreed to go spend money to buy things, and that money will be spent, and that will drive up our spending on defense.
Right.
But the government has also said that there will be further procurements in the future, and that there will also be overall increases in kind of baseline defense spending, again, over the future. And then it is budgeting out the fact that our defense spending, again, per capita, will be heading towards that 2% NATO target. I have to insert into this, it's not that I distrust the federal math. If we buy all the things they say we're going to buy, and it's on time, and it's within the budgeted time frame, and if we raise spending the way we've said we're going to do, I have general faith in the government's math. Again, subject to currency fluctuations, things like that. But generally speaking, defense spending will be going up. The question, and it's a big question, is, are we actually going to do these things?
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to do some of them. I think there is a case to be made for some of them. I think there's political necessity to do some of them. But I just, with any matter of defense spending, and also at this point, I think this government overall has some deliverology credibility problems. Any claim today or any demand today for credit for something that is budgeted for and scheduled 5 years from now,
Right.
I think the smart thing to do is to approach that with a degree of caution.
Mostly, I assume, because there may be a new government making those decisions or not.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. I mean, reasons for skepticism abound. And look, I can make an optimistic scenario for this too. Some of the things that we have budgeted to spend involve replacing equipment we already have that's just aging out. It needs to be replaced. In general, I'm fairly confident we will spend that money. We've also pledged ourselves to a joint modernization of NORAD with the United States. I think for political reasons, it would be suicidal for this government or any government to not follow through on that. So those are the bucks I think we actually will spend. But then where the uncertainty comes in, it's kind of twofold. First of all, will any possible future successor government adhere to this government's defense plans? I don't know. And frankly, at this point, again, given this government's own track record, will this government even adhere to this government's defense plans? I don't know.
So far, we've been talking about just defense spending. How much do we spend on it? That's a really broad term, and I have to admit, I actually don't understand what qualifies as defense spending towards that 2% target. Is it just military equipment and soldiers and ammunition? Are there other things in play here?
That's a great question, and there is some variability about this across the alliance. Certain countries include other things in the envelope that other countries don't. Like some countries, for instance, have said that the money they spend on veterans affairs ought to be considered part of their defense spending. I don't buy that. Like, unless we're planning on taking our fantastic veterans, loading them into a catapult and hurling them at the enemy, I don't think that we should be doing that. But whatever. Like, if some of the European countries want to try to include that stuff, that's their business. In general terms, you basically have it. Defense spending is what we spend on the personnel of the armed forces, on the equipment of the armed forces, the operational budgets that allow those people to do things with that equipment, plus all the kind of supportive bureaucracy at national defense that allows these things to happen, right? So all of your civilian staff there that have to back up the military, right? Because every soldier in the field requires a whole support network back on the home front. All of that stuff generally gets put into it. Plus, there are other things that we can count as defense spending, but I'm not sure we always do. If we're spending money on a peacekeeping mission or a troop training mission in some other country, military support like munitions we've been donating to Ukraine, things like that.
Right.
I honestly don't know if we count that kind of stuff. But in general terms, you can view Canadian defense spending somewhere in the mid $20 billion a year range. One of the problems we also run into in Canada is because of bureaucratic inefficiency, we don't always spend all the money we budget. So one of the problems we might have is that, like, in the defense budget, it might be, I don't know, just a round number here. It's like $1 billion this year for the X munitions program. But then the bureaucrats, the procurement part of the government, can't get that program done. So they delay the program spend to another year. So a budgeted $1 billion doesn't actually get spent. Now, that money goes back to the Treasury and it can be spent the next year. But one of the problems we had, and Anita Anand, who was the defense minister and now is president of the Treasury Board, was actually talking about it just this week. credit to her. I think she understands the urgency of getting Canadian defense spending up. But I also think she's not wrong that a problem we have is that we could pledge $100 billion to defense spending next year. I'm not sure we have the bureaucratic capability to spend that money on anything.
How does the government defend not only not being at 2% right now, but I mean, we've been talking about this in Canada for a long time. Like, we don't generally ever hit the 2% mark. And why do they say we don't do that?
You know, in a weird way, they don't defend it. They just sort of acknowledge it.
It just happens.
Well, yeah. You know, like every once in a while, you do hear some defenses along the lines of, yeah, it's not just the spending, it's the capabilities we offer. Canada can do some things because we have certain technical or personnel expertise that other countries don't. We have a deployable or had a deployable Navy that is capable of doing some things that smaller NATO countries can't. Generally speaking, we have a very well-trained officer corps, so we can lead multinational battle groups or task forces. We are running one of the NATO battle groups in Eastern Europe. It is stretching the army to the breaking point to do it, but there are specific things we can point to as say, okay, so we're not hitting the agreed upon target, but look at these things that we're doing. So occasionally, that is how we've tried to defend it. In recent years, I think more of what we've been doing is acknowledging that more must be done.
We're good at doing that.
Oh, we're great at that. Like if we could hit 2% of GDP of acknowledging the blindingly obvious, we would be doing great. But look, Anita Anand had always been clear in her public comments that Canada understands, particularly since the renewed Russian invasion of Ukraine over 2 years ago, that more needed to be done. Bill Blair, I actually had mentioned this in a column. He was at a defense conference event a couple of months ago, and I had to laugh because based on the speech Minister Blair gave, someone had obviously put in his briefing docket before the speech was written in big, bold letters, acknowledge that more must be done.
Right.
Because like every other sentence out of the minister's mouth was, hey, it's great to be here today. Great to see so many familiar faces. And Canada knows that more must be done. And I would like to acknowledge that we're speaking today on the ancestral homelands of many Indigenous groups, and Canada knows that more must be done on defense. And hey, great to see my good friend Mark over there. And Canada, look, it was ridiculous. Like almost every other sentence was that. And I just took that as, okay, that is not aimed at nerds like you and I. It's not aimed at those incredible, wonderful people who call themselves your listeners. That was aimed at people overseas. That was 100% signaling from Ottawa to our annoyed allies that, well, Canada knows that more must be done. Canada, let me phrase that, make it grammatical. Canada knows that more needs to be done. There, stuck the landing.
There is a NATO summit coming up in July. What is the risk politically for Canada not spending to that 2%?
Oh, gosh. I mean, that's a wide open question. How dark and dystopian do you want to get? So every once in a while you hear musings of Canada should be kicked out of NATO, right? But no, there actually is no mechanism in NATO to kick countries out. And if there were, we wouldn't be top of the list. It would probably be Hungary or Turkey that gets kicked out first because those are the troublesome, annoying allies in the alliance. There is no mechanism to kick Canada out for underspending. But what can happen, sort of in a medium bad case scenario, is I think what's already happening, where we see that allies, great example would be the Pacific Alliance we saw forming up between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, where I have on good authority from sources in the Canadian government that not only were we not invited, we weren't even told it was happening until it was publicly announced.
I see.
Now, people can make the point that it was mostly focused on nuclear submarines. There's no role for Canada in that alliance. There's truth to that, but there's also a very obvious and clear counter argument was there are other things that we could have contributed. There are other things we could have been asked to do, and our closest allies didn't even see a reason to tell us that it was happening. So that's a problem. And then there are darker scenarios that, again, I know this idea is floating. I don't know how much it's been discussed openly, but this is a conversation I've had with senior government officials and also people sort of more in the think tank or academic world. If Mr. Trump is reelected in the United States in the fall, hypothetically speaking, one of the things he might do is basically wake up one morning and go, I am imposing a 10% trade tariff on any country that is not meeting the 2% NATO target, or something like that. And what happens to the Canadian economy if Mr. Trump decides to take direct, targeted economic measures against those NATO countries that are laggards on the defense target. As one Canadian official said to me, with some frustration, because this Canadian official really believes we ought to be doing a better job than we're doing on this front, it was suggested to me that we're going to pay either way. There are ways that we can pay and actually end up benefiting ourselves, or there are ways that we can pay that end up benefiting American consumers. And it's kind of up to us at this point which direction we choose to go in.
When we look at those other NATO countries, I guess specifically those in Europe and around there, are they ramping up their spending because of the geopolitical situation in Europe, but also, I guess, around the world? Like, you mentioned we've continually said we must do more, we will do more, et cetera. What are other countries doing generally right now?
There is obviously variation within the alliance. Not everyone is doing the same thing. Certain countries, I would say, are in a relatively similar position to Canada, where I think there is sort of like intellectual understanding that we need to be doing better or more, but that doesn't always translate yet into action. And I think there are some of the other allied countries would be in generally that same boat. Mm-hmm. Other allied countries, though, 100% are arming up as quickly as they can. The United States is working on retooling its wartime economy. Some of the European allies are as well. The Baltic countries in particular, kind of the closer you are to the Russian border, the more serious you are likely to be taking this. And there are also some NATO countries that have actually always kind of kept a fairly powerful military. The French are occasionally troublesome in terms of being willing to use their armed forces, but France has generally prioritized maintaining a fairly effective and independent national defense. Again, I've mentioned the Baltic countries. They have small but effective militaries relative to their size. The newest NATO members, Finland and Sweden, getting them into the alliance was a huge win for the alliance because those are two countries that, though relatively small, have always taken defense seriously. So one of the issues all of us are running into, that includes Canada very much, and I could give tangible examples of this, but it also includes the United States, is that we kind of took a 30-year break from history. And we thought after the end of the Cold War that history was over, that large conventional military forces were no longer necessary. What you needed instead were light, rapidly deployable military forces that could go in for like a humanitarian mission or a peacekeeping mission, fight the Taliban or fight Iraqi insurgents or something like that. We got rid of a lot of those larger, heavier military formations, things like tank units and artillery and attack helicopters.
All the stuff Ukraine needs now.
Yeah, exactly. Or that we, in theory, God forbid, might need if the situation in Europe were to escalate. We got rid of a lot of that stuff. And as we got rid of it, the economic case to have industries capable of building that stuff and supporting it went away. So over decades, there were whole industrial lines across the alliance that used to build missiles or artillery shells or tank guns or anything. And they just shut down and they don't exist anymore. So let me give you a small Canadian example. Again, this is me citing a Canadian official. Canada does have the ability to manufacture not all, but much of the ammunition that our soldiers would use in battle. But over the last few decades, we have basically been manufacturing enough ammunition to support, training exercises. Like we're going out to the range today and we're going to practice with our rifles or with our artillery tubes. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, like a little bit of a margin to respond to an unexpected event. It's like, oops, okay, there's an emergency somewhere. We need to send 200 peacekeepers to join some NATO force and they need to bring ammunition with them. We could meet that kind of requirement with domestic production. But what we're seeing in Ukraine is that the Ukrainians are expending like an astonishing amount of ammunition to hold back the Russians because the Russians outnumber them. How do you compensate for that? Well, you try to compensate from it with superior firepower. The entire Western world, Canada included, no longer has the industrial base to make ammunition and weapons that quickly. We are starting to fix that, but it's going to be a multi-year project because I spoke to one guy who actually is in the munitions industry. And I said to him, are you getting contracts to do this kind of work? He said, oh, for sure. He goes, there's definitely demand from Canadian sources and also allied sources for all of the fancy things that we can make. But before I can make any of those things, I have to have the machines that make the stuff made for me. And there's no real domestic manufacturing capacity to make the tools to make the munitions or to make the machines to make the munitions. We can fix all these problems. Like, this is just a matter of spending, time and money and getting the stuff manufactured. But it's a 2 to 3 year window to do that. And Canada started really late. Some of the other allies moved much faster than we did.
We've talked a ton about procuring new equipment and making repairs and making sure that everything is in good working order. If we really wanted to beef up our military, what is the state of recruitment? Do we even have the troops that we would theoretically outfit with all this new equipment?
Oh, that's a great question. Short answer, no. Okay. So right now, you can always quibble with the numbers, and the numbers are always a moving target. They're a rearward-looking indicator, right? So, I don't know how many people are in the military right now, but I've looked at the numbers for last year, which is what they were published. In recent years, the Canadian Armed Forces have had a real problem, and it's been a problem on two ends. Exits from the military have been increasing, and recruitment has been slowing down. Some of this undoubtedly is due to two things that are well understood, and we won't go after them at length. The pandemic screwed up lives all over the place, and it made doing everything harder. So that's understood. Also, one of the issues, of course, is that it's a really hot Canadian economy out there. We are having labor shortages across a lot of the economy. People with military training often have very specialized skills that command top dollar in the private sector. So there's been a lot of inducements to leave military life, or maybe to never join it in the first place. And a widely recognized problem, and this is something the military has acknowledged and has spoken about very openly, is that the recruitment process in the Canadian Armed Forces has typically been an absolute disaster, where it takes over a year to process even a perfectly qualified applicant with no red flags, getting them from showing up at a recruiting office and saying, I want to enlist, to getting them inducted into the armed forces. It takes way, way, way too long. And I mentioned a hot economy already, right? People move on. They don't sit around waiting for the military to get back to them. They get a job. They actually go and plant down roots somewhere.
Sure.
There is some good news on this front. My understanding, and I had interviewed the Chief of the Defense Staff, General Wayne Eyre, just a few months ago. He actually had some great news on that front, which was that lots of hard work by the armed forces as like a bureaucratic exercise has started to reverse that process. So in recent years, we've been bleeding personnel. Last year, we seem to have hit a bottom and have started to come up a bit, which is great. That is genuinely fantastic news. But we now need to sustain that and build on that and sustain that for years or probably decades. First of all, just to get the military back to where it nominally should be, and then also to staff it up to the level where the equipment we've been purchasing would kind of require it to be. And also the fact that, as I'm sure you've noticed, we've talked about this before on this very podcast, the world geopolitically right now is a dumpster fire, and it seems to be getting worse, not better. So we're probably going to need a bigger military just to respond to events outside of our borders. And something you and I have also talked about on this very podcast before, the military is almost busier than ever responding to domestic emergencies.
Right.
Wildfires, floods, things like that. So you've got a very small military force that needs to do training exercises in the art of war, how to kill people and break stuff overseas. And we keep disrupting those training exercises and grabbing all those people and saying, actually, you're going to go fill sandbags and throw them in front of an overflowing river for the next few months. This has been the process that we've been having for years now. So we need a bigger military just to begin balancing our domestic and our foreign commitments, or we're going to have to start making some decisions about what we're no longer going to use the military to do.
That kind of brings me to the last thing that I want to get at, which is as we hopefully, according at least to the government, increase our defense spending over the next few years, are we doing it to bring back that capacity that you just mentioned, to do the big things and really solidify what we're creating here in terms of our military? Or are we finding ways to spend this money in ways that will please our allies and other NATO member countries, and sort of doing it to keep up appearances and, again, as you mentioned, potentially avoid the wrath of Mr. Trump?
you asked me, is it one or the other? And my answer is yes. Like, I think it's both of those things, right? And I'm going to leave it up to you and the listeners to decide if they're a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of person, or having a glass half full or glass half empty kind of day. There are things Canada has said it is going to do, and I would even go so far as to say there are some things we've started to do that are good, that are necessary, that are overdue, and that are important. And to the extent the government is doing these necessary and important and overdue things, I give them credit. The issue that I have is that I'm not sure we have, as a country, a vision of what we want our armed forces to be and what we want them to do. So I think right now we're under enormous pressure to spend more money. And the good news for us is that there are things, relatively uncontroversial things, that we can spend the money on. So for this year and the next, and probably out for the next 3, 4, maybe even 5 years, we can spend money on stuff that will goose our numbers. It'll get our numbers up in terms of hitting that NATO target. And it will also sort of uncontroversially restore capabilities that we already have. One of the things that I don't think is well understood is that you could spend tens of billions of dollars, like many tens of billions of dollars, on the Canadian military right now without adding a new capability. What you would do is actually give real world effect to capabilities that effectively right now only exist on paper. So the Canadian military, in theory, has the ability to do certain things that it probably couldn't in practice, at least not for very long. And you could sink billions of bucks into just getting those theoretical capabilities turned into real capabilities. One of the things you could do, if you really wanted to give just a short-term shot in the arm to the Canadian defense spending, you could sink billions of bucks into bringing existing military infrastructure into a state of good repair. The Department of National Defense owns a ton of property. Some of it would be sort of clerical space, right? Just like offices and whatnot. But some of it would be military housing on bases. It would be military training facilities or aircraft hangars or radar sites, things like that. Much of this stuff needs either replacement or refurbishment. That's billions of bucks that, again, we can spend in the short term. It will give our numbers a shot in the arm, and it's uncontroversial. But sooner or later, we're still going to have to decide, what kind of a military do we need? What kind of a military do we want? What are the things we're willing to not be good at to make a decision that that's not a capability we're going to have? We're going to rely on allies for that. What are things that we identify as core, essential things that we feel for our own security we have to be able to do for ourselves? And what are things that maybe we don't have to do them, but we see advantage in being able to do them? It would give us a chip to play at the allied bargaining table, to be crass about this, for lack of a better term. We have not had that conversation yet. So if you want to spend 50, even 100 billion bucks over the next 5 years on the armed forces, I'm not sure we do, and I'm not sure we will, but if you wanted to, you could. And what you would end up with at the end of that spending, assuming all went well, is basically a fully revitalized version of the military we in theory already have. But then you're going to need to ask yourself, is this the right military? Can it do the right things? Are there things we should be able to do that we currently can't? Should it be bigger? Should it be smaller? Do we want the ability to deploy troops abroad? Are we more worried about domestic emergency response? Right now, we're kind of just lurching from either crisis to crisis, or frankly, from political problem to political problem. That's no way to run a railroad, but it is right now how we are running defense policy in this country.
Matt, thank you so much for this. I do love talking about the military with you because you're passionate about it, and it really helps me learn.
Well, I'm here to brighten everybody's day. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and God help us all.
Matt Gurney is a co-founder of readtheline.ca. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. If you type Matt's name into the search bar, you will find those other episodes he referenced. He's not lying. He's been talking about this stuff a long time. If you want to offer feedback to us, or even to Matt, we'll pass it along. You can write to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can call and leave a voicemail. The number is 416-935-5935. The Big Story is available in every single podcast player. If your podcast player allows you to rate or review or recommend this show, we recommend that you do that. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.